Just as different goals can have different priorities to the organization as a whole, different objectives might be more or less important than others. When we look at these objectives, there are four key categories that we can use to help rank them. First among these are organizational and environmental factors. Second are constraints on our available solutions. Third would be technology and infrastructure, followed by the potential value that that objective can create. Let's look at each of these a little more closely, beginning with organizational and environmental factors. We have to ask ourselves a number of questions, beginning with how well the objective aligns with organizational goals. It's possible that we have an objective that somewhat serves an organizational goal, whereas we have another that's directly in line with what the organization's goals are. In that case, well, the one that fits the goal better would be the objective worthy of higher priority. However, it's more complicated than that. We also need to consider what stakeholders may support the completion of the objective and which may resist its completion. In certain cases, an objective might be, in our opinion, directly in line with the organization's goals. However, we may know that it simply doesn't have the political support necessary within the organization to move forward. In that case, the pragmatic solution is to put a little less emphasis on that one and a little more on the one that's more likely to find success. After all, even if it's a great objective, if we have no chance of successfully completing it due to resistance from within, then it's not actually going to have any benefit for us at all. Further, we should also consider what market conditions may either help or hinder meeting this objective. What are our competitors doing? What's the regulatory environment like? What about our customers, and how are their preferences shifting over time? All of these factors should be considered. Next are constraints on our available solutions. First, we should look a little more closely at those legal and regulatory hurdles in particular. And we should look at how objectives can be impacted by organizational policies and procedures. If they're not impacted directly by some sort of external force, such as regulatory restrictions, perhaps our own organization has policies and procedures in place that would either help or hinder our ability to complete this objective successfully. Third, which objectives are the most practical for us to complete, given the organizational resources, talent, and focus that's liable to be granted to the eventual project team responsible for taking this objective and completing it? This goes back to a lot of those cultural questions regarding where support and resistance might come from within the organization. We have to be smart about how we move forward, being certain to build consensus in the way that we accomplish these objectives so that we can have the most positive impact on the organization as a whole. When it comes to technology and infrastructure, what IT infrastructure or other types of infrastructure are going to be required in order to complete the objective? Further, how much of this is already in place? This is another area where we look at where we currently are and where we need to be, and can complete some gap analysis accordingly. We should also consider how difficult, costly, and time-consuming it'll be in order to develop any of that necessary infrastructure not already in place. It could be that we have the ability to complete an objective if we completely overhaul our internal infrastructure, but the support to do so is simply not there. The amount of time it will take to complete that overhaul means that we'll likely miss the opportunity that we're trying to chase, and the amount of value that we create would be less than the cost that it would take in order to complete all of this new overhaul of our infrastructure. And as such, perhaps it's not a very good objective after all. On the other hand, even if an objective has a relatively small benefit, if it has genuine support within the organization and can be accomplished within the existing confines of the company's infrastructure and technological environment, then perhaps it is worth pursuing because the cost to us to do so is so little. This all leads inevitably to potential value. What's the net benefit that can be expected from completing the objective? Not just the amount of benefit that we expect, but the amount of benefit less the cost and labor and expense when it comes not only to money, but also focus and strategic resources that were required in order to complete the objective. How long will it take us to earn back our investment? Even if the payoff could be huge, if it's going to take too long, it might not be in the best interest of the company. On the other hand, even if the payoff's relatively small, if it's an easy win for us, then it might be worth accomplishing because the amount of resources required would be very small compared to that value. Does this objective offer a greater return on investment than other options? It could be that there are alternatives to the objective that we are looking at and analyzing, and by pursuing those objectives instead, we can line up with the organization's goals just as well while unlocking additional value that wouldn't be possible through the first objective. Finally, does the alignment of the objective with the organization's goals somehow result in a higher value than the objective in a vacuum might otherwise indicate? This goes back to the example we used earlier when speaking about the Apollo program and NASA and all of the external benefits and cascading positive elements that came out of the research and development done as part of that program. Here we could see the same sort of thing, where the objective itself might only directly result in a certain amount of value, but the amount of value created by aligning perfectly with the organization's goals might be much higher. For example, if we look at a new recycling initiative for the company, it might actually be a loss leader for us. Might be an area where we don't make nearly as much money on our material collections as we spend making sure that recycling is taking place accordingly. However, if an organizational goal for us is to be environmentally friendly, then it could well be worth the cost because it's something that we believe in, and it's an expense that goes directly toward one of our organization's strategic goals. When looking at these 4 areas and others to consider when ranking objectives, we can turn to a useful tool known as SWOT analysis. Our organizational goals and objectives are not always clearly defined, especially at the outset, and SWOT analysis can not only help us in forming these goals and objectives, but also in collecting insight from stakeholders that can help us to better gauge which objectives might be those most worth pursuing. If you don't know already, SWOT refers to strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and it often is filled out using a visualized square pattern as you see on the left side of the screen. Beginning with strengths, which of course are ways the organization is well positioned to solve problems or leverage opportunities, examples might be a high level of customer loyalty already in place, favorable component cost contracts, and a talented and committed staff. On the other hand, weaknesses are ways in which the organization is not well positioned to solve problems or take advantage of opportunities. Oftentimes, we may develop objectives that are directly targeted at either improving or eliminating entirely these areas of weakness. Examples of potential weaknesses include low levels of customer satisfaction, long lead times on new development projects, or lack of internal expertise within areas identified as important by the organization. Opportunities are externally focused in nature and can also include not only leveraging opportunities for positive benefits, but mitigating any problems and helping to eliminate any issues and negative factors that might arise. Examples of potential opportunities include new market areas that might be seen as ripe for development, seeing that upgraded technology and processes could result in increased productivity and reduced costs, and discovering that unserved customer needs exist that the organization could help tackle and potentially benefit from. Threats are also externally focused in nature, but are any factors that may stymie our success or completion of objectives. Examples of this include competitors introducing new product lines, new laws that require changes to our current business practices, or any shortages in supplies for necessary components. Generally speaking, our objectives are created based on opportunities and threats because objectives tend to be more externally focused in nature. We're responding to something that we see outside in the market. In a way of thinking, this is even true when it comes to internal objectives that we might have, because we're seeking other areas within our own company where improvement can be made. These objectives are created based on those opportunities or threats, but they're designed specifically and ranked based on the strengths and weaknesses that are exhibited within the organization. In some cases, we may seek to capitalize on objectives where our strengths are high. In others, it may be a high objective precisely because it's an area of weakness for us and one that we can no longer tolerate. SWOT analysis helps to provide greater context to our needs analysis process, and it can also be helpful in identifying root causes, which will be one of the key topics in our next module.